Welcome to the Modern Therapist's Guide to Nothing.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Dave. I'm joined here with my co-host, Greg, and we are your very, very, very unconventional therapists. And we are doing the dang thing out here.
We are, Dave. We're tackling something extremely dark today. It's a somber.
So let's talk about something not so dark to start off with, Greg. Why don't you tell us how your day is?
So far, so good. As you can tell, I just got done working out a little bit.
Yeah.
Getting that cerebellum activated.
Yep.
You know, that way I can feel better about myself.
Glad your cerebellum is activated.
Hey, it's a step to take to feeling good. And, you know, the subject we're going to talk about today, you need to be doing stuff like this. You need to be doing things in your life that make you feel good.
Yeah, my day was pretty good too.
Okay.
I love how every episode I've started off recently with asking how your day is, and you never ask in return. So it makes me think you don't want to know.
I do want to know. I do. It's just, I just get so antsy to get into this stuff.
You do.
I get excited about it.
Because if you know anything about me, you know that I live to give you anxiety.
Yeah, you do. And you do a good job of it. And it's an odd way that you do it. You do it by staying real calm and talking real slow. And it just makes me.
I know.
Like just fall, like, you know, I'm like crawling out of my skin.
I can almost see it most of the time. And that gives me so much pleasure.
You're like, why is your screen vibrating? And that's just me shaking.
You're still sweating, Greg. Your workout ended 2 hours ago.
That's because I'm overweight.
I'm anxious and overweight. No,
but just barely. All right, Dave.
Even if you were, we would still love you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Of course. Why wouldn't you? And today, Dave, we're talking about suicide. We're talking about a forest, but we're talking about the cultural views of suicide, specifically in Japan.
Yeah. So that's all true. That is what our topic about is today is about. Before we dig into that topic, I do want to just tell people those are the topics we'll be getting into. And if that is obviously that can be triggering for a large population of people, whether it's personal experience or just sensitivity to those type of topics or your own personal struggles. So if those are things that you struggle with, I hate to say this, but I will recommend you give this episode a skip.
It's a dark one.
I don't like recommending that because obviously I do feel like there's value to everything, but I also don't want somebody to have difficulty because of a topic we decided that we wanted to try to, look into further.
Well, Dave, if there's a darkness inside of you, a shadow somewhere in there, the only way to kind of dispel that is to shine a little light on it. And I think that's what we try to do here. We're not talking about suicide and the suicide forest because it's fun. We're talking about it because maybe people can glean something from this. And in the end, we'll talk about ways or things you could say if you know someone in your life, or if you felt this way, the ways that you can think, things that you can do if you're feeling like you want to take your own life. Because we live to prevent that. And in the West, we'll talk about that's our culture. Suicide is never a good thing here. But when we're talking about Japan, things are a little bit more complicated.
Sure.
So Japan, the suicide rate is a serious concern. It's not in the top 10 like it used to be, but it's the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 20 and 44 and women between the ages of 15 and 34. Those are some staggering statistics, Dave.
Yeah.
I mean, the leading cause of death in those young people.
And that is staggering.
It's staggering. That is. It's almost like veterans. And I think there's a connection there because Japanese men are twice as likely to commit suicide, especially after, they're divorce or they lose a job, because historically marriage and your employment is supposed to last forever in Japan. It's this passed down idea of decorum and stability. So the world has changed a lot, but the cultural consciousness of the people of Japan hasn't.
Yeah. And Greg, I don't know what the current statistic is because, and we'll get into why some of the current statistics are hard to find in regards to suicide in Japan. but also elderly population have a high rate of suicide, which they attribute to the idea that like life insurance is still able to be paid out for suicide cases, which is different in other countries, obviously.
Obviously, yeah. And the insurance companies in Japan are very lax on suicide because of the cultural significance of it.
Yeah.
I mean, in the West, Dave, we sort of, I don't want to say disgrace our family, but no one thinks it's a good thing if someone commits suicide. But in the Japanese culture, if you disgrace your family, like if you're a politician, you do something horrible, they find like nude pictures or whatever it is, you lose your job, you've embezzled something, you do something terrible. A way to, bring honor or restore honor to your family is to commit suicide. Unfortunately, that's the way they feel, and that's what it is culturally there, and that's been going on for centuries.
In some instances. So
in
like
some instances,
let's not, because I just don't want to generalize, because then we'll get a bunch of really negative reviews, and we don't need that. But you're right. That is in some instances and some populations within their culture that can be the case. There are some others that also reject that idea and like kind of share some of our beliefs as far as like more putting it onto like the people you're leaving behind and how that impacts them.
Yeah. So, but you know how I think of it? It's like, of course, like the modern day Japanese people, I think more often than not are going to really, they see that suicide is a problem. They don't want it to continue. And just like in America, we see racism as a problem. We don't want to continue. But there's this, you know, this bias that's almost intrinsic in us, that it's just sort of natural in a way for a lot of people. We want to admit that idea is gone in America, but it's not. Just like I think they want to think that idea and that cultural like heartbeat is gone in Japan, but it's not, because this goes all the way back to samurai. That's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Like the Bushido, or way of the warrior, which is this rigid code of principles and morals. If you think about it, Dave, like chivalry was in the West, chivalry being this idea that like you have to hold up to a certain standard, these values. This is dead. Chivalry's long dead. Don't we all say that?
Yeah.
in this culture.
Yeah.
But this Bushido, it's not. This still kind of is. The Japanese people still kind of pride themselves on, great things, like loyalty, politeness, honesty, character, self-control. These were all tenets of the samurai. And these, at a time, were more important than life itself. And anything that you did that was the antithesis of these things, anything that you did to dishonor yourself or your family or the master you served, you had to commit suicide. And that's how you brought honor back to your family. It's pretty intense.
And it's so funny because when you think about Japanese culture and we think of some like the more negative thoughts or feelings or emotions that we could think of from just our own exposure to Japanese culture. Obviously, two people, I'm pretty sure you've never been to Japan, have you?
No, but I've seen so many, like I've seen Three Ninjas. I mean, lots of.
Oh my God,
movies.
Really?
With the samurai movies, I've seen them.
Okay. You're a joke. All right. So when I think of negative concepts that I attribute to Japan, I think of words like dishonored. I think of words like disgraced, shame. Those emotions from our exposure. Maybe to Three Ninjas, Greg.
Yeah, you know what I mean, though. Like that's our idea of it. That's our pop culture, and we'll talk about that.
And that's how we get our exposure. For those of us who haven't been able to go to Japan, like we get it through media and things like and art and things like that. So I've always kind of thought about those like disgrace, shame, dishonor as being like really negative feelings and emotions and ideas that they have there. While those here are still like super negative, like I don't feel like someone's ashamed of their family and we would like be better off if they committed suicide, right?
I think where you're getting at is like they hold themselves to a higher standard. And
Yes.
I think that's essentially what they do. And we give ourselves a break a lot more. And look, hey, Japan is they invented the great things. Like they're so technologically advanced because of this, though. So it's like it's a double-edged sword, not to use the samurai stuff, but it really is. It's like, yes, all these they hold themselves to such a high standard, which creates, wealth and power and all these things. But it's also, if you don't make it, if you don't, reach these things, and not everybody can, then you feel completely like a failure.
That really long thing I was trying to get out that I didn't really get out, and you just clarified, it was all about like, we are so egocentric and they are so family oriented. Their biggest fear is disgracing the family, being ashamed to the family. We care about disgracing ourselves to some extent, but even when we do, we're a culture that really prides itself on like, be kind to yourself, have compassion. And I still agree with those things, but like we don't care as much, I feel, about things that are less about us.
We're also a lot better at deceiving ourselves.
I am not saying we're better at anything.
Well, I know. That's what I mean. I don't know if it's a good thing to be better at deceiving yourself, but we are. Like, I think this culture is one that's like, hey, look, I made a mistake and I need to pay for it.
Yes. And we can be like, it's their fault.
Exactly.
F my family.
Exactly.
And like,
exactly. That's what we find ourselves doing.
Yeah.
So Dave, if you were, a samurai and, anywhere from the 1100s to the 1800s, they had a good run. If you did violate these codes and you brought shame in any way, and over these centuries, it got pretty easy to violate these codes. And what you would do is something called seppuku.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is when it's a ritual. It's a Japanese suicide ritual, and you disembowel yourself. And it's kind of a brutal process where you stick a knife in your stomach and you drag it across, and then you pull it up, and you literally, like, your bowels, you disembowel yourself.
It's why
would that be the most painful way?
Yeah. Well, but that's the point, I guess, right?
Well, you have you have a friend with you, and as at the first sight of pain, hopefully they decapitate you. So, I mean, that's kind of the relief there, right? Yeah. So this isn't just if you brought shame to yourself. This is if your master brought shame to his self, or, you would still have to restore the honor of him and yourself by seppuku.
So it's the word itself. I'm like trying to figure out how do you say it? Like, I'm going to seppuku myself. Is that, or is it like, I'm going to,
I think they say like, maybe. Well, actually the word for suicide is back then is jagai. And actually that word meant, because, all right, so it goes a little bit further than this too, because if the samurai disgraced himself, then of course, their wives are disgraced, and they would have their own ritual where they kind of slice their neck. But before doing that, they would tie their knees together so that when they fell to the ground, they wouldn't be in a dishonorable pose. This is how intense
and thought out.
Yeah, like there's a lot of decorum here. They really take pride in honor and the way things are supposed to be. And so the samurai, the thing we're not really saying here is the samurai, and these are like the higher classes. The lower classes aren't even allowed to commit suicide that way. It's like reserved for them. But they wanted, their whole idea was to say like, look, we're the higher classes. We need to be an example for the lower classes. That's how they viewed it.
Yeah.
And Dave, this didn't just go away in like this was going on in the 1100s, the 1200s, all the way up to the 1800s. But, when Japan surrendered after World War II, a lot of the officers, like you said, how do you say it? They committed seppuku. They did this thing.
What would be like an example? Do you know any examples of something that would be worthy of having to commit seppuku?
Yeah. So obviously, that's like a romantic relationship with someone else's wife. That's a thing. The feudal lord that you serve as a samurai committing some kind of act of treason or blasphemy to the emperor. Anything. It really gets to the point. So if you list off all those things that that they're into, so politeness, loyalty, anything, your character, all these ideas that you kind of put in place, if you can think about chivalry, anything that kind of goes against that, and I guess it's on a spectrum, is you're up for that. And I bet you it's the kind of thing too, like in Salem, where people would say, oh, look, that's worthy of seppuku because that person being dead is going to give you power. And it probably became this really corrupted thing. So, I mean, even think of World War II, though. Like, this is part of the culture. I mean, we've all heard of kamikaze pilots.
Yes.
This is, I mean, that's something that's...
So, Greg, for people who don't, what could you explain?
Well, these were Japanese fighter pilots who would bomb ships, and they would train, and they wouldn't use bombs. They would use their own planes and crash them into ships. And it was something like, 700 and some odd kamikaze pilots died during World War II, but they took 4,000 lives of sailors. So this was effective, and they didn't think about it as a negative thing. They thought about it as an honorable thing. So this idea of suicide being an honorable thing is threaded throughout Japanese culture.
Yeah, exactly. So their version of suicide, as we're describing it, is shrouded in honor. It's redemption in some ways.
Absolutely.
It's just kind of paying dues, maybe for trying to right your wrongs, or it's just like being like an honorable representative, or even a hero to your culture, right?
So that's ingrained. And I think that's obviously going to be tied to the high suicide rates.
And I think you said this earlier, but just to kind of, help people understand, like, this is why this, like, when we're talking about these high suicide rates, while it still is hard for people to wrap their heads around, I'm sure in that culture, it makes more sense why it's so common as opposed to in our culture, where it's just shrouded in literally the opposite. Like the views of suicide, I think while we can have empathy and sympathy, there's a lot of other really negative connotations with suicide in our culture.
Absolutely. And we always, when we talk about it, it was like, oh, they, you might even hear someone, and this is it's like a terrible thing to say, but like you might hear someone say, and it's common to hear, oh, they took the easy way out. Things got really hard and they took the easy way out. And the Japanese didn't feel that way. They thought this was the hard way out and the honorable way out when things got really, really, really bad.
Yeah. And the other part of this is, so obviously what we're describing here with these things isn't necessarily mental health.
Not at all, which is interesting. That's a great point. It's very interesting.
So when we're talking about what we're about to shift to with the suicide forest, we're probably talking about mental health in some
No, Dave,
can
we pause on that for a second? Because we just talked about suicide for a good 20 minutes, and you're right. I hadn't even thought about it. We're not talking about mental health at all yet.
No. We're talking about actions that are actually void of emotions, other than, like we said, like the way they're perceived by their families and other people in their community.
Although I would probably argue, if we really dove into this, I don't think the suicides of anybody does any good for anyone. We can talk about that later, of course. But yeah, Dave, the forest, finally, we bring it up. What do we got?
All right. So the forest, suicide forest, also known, well, its actual name is, oh boy, here I go.
Go for it.
Aokigahara. How's that sound?
That sounds pretty good.
So that is the actual name of the forest. It is a beautiful forest. Absolutely beautiful. If you see photos, like lush, dense, green. It actually sits at the base of Mount Fuji and was created by one of their last major eruptions, which, when I looked up, could have been around December of 1707. So the forest has obviously been around for quite some time. When they erupted, the lava hardened, and green has been growing on it ever since. And did you know, Greg, it stays green all year round?
Yeah, and it's this other thing, it's like eerily quiet. Were you going to talk about that?
Yes. So it's eerily quiet. It's so dense that like light might like seep in through the trees, but like it's not. It's kind of got a shadow to it, I guess you would say, or it's 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 eerie. It's a little eerie, but it's also beautiful. If I'm sure people can envision how that must look.
Well, I think that the beauty adds to the creepiness in a way.
Yeah.
Like it's beauty and juxtaposed with death.
Well, and also like we already have that idea in our head, so
That's
we're
true.
kind of already intertwining it, right?
Yeah.
So that probably plays a big factor in it too. Some other cool little factors about this though is like it has these lava caves, and there's a few of them. Some of them are pretty large lava caves, and they stay cool. Like some of them stay cool year round. Like the temperature is always cold inside some of them, which I think is really cool. There's some that have like I think they have like stalactites, stalagmites. Which one is
Yeah,
it?
but they're made out of
Lights.
ice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I love that stuff, and they actually like light some of them up. I heard for like tourists and stuff like that. Kind of like what we have as in our caverns and stuff like that. When you go into them and there's lights kind of illuminating. So it's a really beautiful place. And as you said, there's this dark side to it as well. So I mean, you might get tourists going there for the dark side of it, but also you might get people just kind of wanting to walk through it because it's beautiful. One of the things about this place is also that it's the second. Well, and this stat, and I'll get to this in a second. This stat, I don't know how accurate this is currently, but at one point it was the second most popular suicide spot on Earth. And do you know what number one was?
I do. Yeah. And
The Golden Gate Bridge.
Which makes sense. They're building a huge net around it. Or maybe they already have. Because so many people commit suicide there. And it's costing like millions and millions of dollars. But look, it's going to prevent a lot of suicide. So, I mean, the forest will end up being, I guess, and I hate to say it that way, but the most popular place.
If that were to
change.
Yep. So when you're entering the forest, when you pull up, there's a parking lot in the entrance. And there is this cool Vice documentary. Did you watch that, Greg, for research purposes?
No.
I had seen it years ago, and it's actually pretty like powerful to watch because basically you're being toured around by one of the rangers of the park, and the rangers have a really dark job, and it's essentially to discover and track down either dead bodies or people who might be contemplating suicide.
Because there really is that many suicides there. There's like,
yes.
Like about 100 a year. That's a lot.
Estimates claim that it's 30 to 100. And it's hard for them to really say because some bodies are never found. And you never know, like, how long they can figure out obviously how long someone's been there, but it's hard to say if they haven't discovered everybody. So
now, in this documentary, Dave, could I ask you, do they run into any?
He finds suicide? A person. Yes, wow. He does. And he talks to him, and they're obviously, used to talking to people who are struggling. So it's interesting to watch. I actually do recommend it. It's available on YouTube, or if you have access to Vice station, I'm sure it's on there somewhere. So when they pull up to the parking lot, though, one of the things that really strikes you is that there's cars left. So some of them have been sitting there for a while, and that's because obviously, their owner never returned. So that's kind of already before you even get into the park, like an eerie kind of ominous thing you might see right away. There is a sign that before you enter the forest now that translates to your life is a precious gift from your parents. Please think about your parents, siblings, and children. Don't keep it to yourself. Talk about your troubles and then contact the Suicide Prevention Association. Right there, Greg, like that's something that was added obviously over time to address some of that. And there's other signs around the park, around the forest, kind of highlighting the suicide prevention stuff.
So there is like evidence that there's a cultural shift in the way that they view suicide.
Well, yes, for sure. And there actually steps are being taken. Think about the message in that though, and how that fits into their culture based on what we were already saying though. Think your life is a precious gift from your parents. Please think about your parents, your siblings, your children. So it's like they're using that strong connection that culture has to family to try to emphasize that when you take your life, it's not just you that's impacted. It's not just your life that ends. It's you impact so many people around you that
Yeah, it
need
also
you.
is like very Frankel to be thinking of, like, think about the things that have kept you from committing suicide thus far.
Yeah.
It's a good way to think about it.
These park rangers have such a tough job. They have to patrol the park. As I mentioned, they're kind of looking for certain things. They might be looking for tents, because in those tents might be somebody that's camping out and, contemplating what they want to do with their life, or they might stumble across the body of someone who made that decision.
Usually hanging, right?
Hanging or jumping off of tall things. Yeah. Yeah. So if they see somebody with a tent, the idea is that that's someone who potentially could be contemplating suicide. So they'll then at that point kind of go up to the person and try to gently talk to them and, encourage them to go home, to leave. So those are like things they might be looking for. So when campers are going in there or people are going into the forest, they might be using like a tape or some kind of plastic ribbon, and they'll be tying it around the trees to mark their path. Do you know why that is?
Little Hansel and Gretel action.
Yeah, but do you know why they use tape and not like a modern day device?
No.
Okay. Some of this might be debunkable. I did read some conflicting information. One of the thoughts is because of this, the forest has the soil has magnetic iron that it's really rich in. It can actually disrupt cell service, GPS systems, and compasses. I did hear though that might not be as accurate as it might. Well, maybe it's changed over time. Who knows?
Yeah.
But that might not be completely accurate. But that is the general idea.
But
So
you can imagine that's a pretty creepy element to the thing where like your phone starts not working.
Yeah. I did hear with compasses, if you hold it at like a certain height, you could avoid the compass from having issues. But like, who uses compasses anymore?
Oh, not many of us.
No.
I could bring a compass and still be lost because I wouldn't have any idea how to use it.
It's going north. Great. Is that good?
Yeah.
I think I just got to keep going north.
Well, you want to head west back to, Rhode Island.
So that's the idea of why there's like a ton of like tape and ribbon all throughout the forest. And that's why it's basically people who are trying to have some sort of path back if they decide to change their mind, if they have a change of heart.
Wow.
So that's another thing that the Rangers would be looking for. Obviously, they might be tracking down the tape and looking for who's at the other end of it.
That is
if they find a body, they have to carry the body to a local station, and they actually have a special room for suicide victims. Did you hear about any of this?
No.
I also heard, because of a tradition, which we probably will get to later if we talk a little bit about paranormal. So yes, this might get into some paranormal territory, but that they take turns. The park rangers take turns sleeping in the room with the corpses. And
why?
You would ask that. So the idea is that there's this whole process of, I don't know if I want to say this now because we're going to get into the paranormal stuff. I'll say a little bit. Okay. It's to provide comfort to I guess you would say like the spirit.
Oh, I love that, actually.
So that it doesn't get unsettled and then stay in the body, reanimate the body.
Okay, fair enough. It's like, I really like that, actually.
It's there to like just provide comfort and allow the person to, move on. Otherwise, it might stay and latch to something or something along those lines. It's Yuri. Yuri is a Japanese term for a spirit or ghost.
Yeah, Yuri. When you think of Yuris, you're thinking of like The Grudge and The Ring and that kind of really creepy Japanese folklore. Japanese folklore can be really creepy, but we will get into that a little bit.
Before, I want to just mention there's a few things that the Japanese government have done aside from just putting up a sign. So in 2017, they actually made a plan to start to reduce the suicide rates by 30% over the next decade. So one of the things they did was obviously start putting signs with suicide prevention line and stuff like that. They increased patrols. I read that they were posting security cameras at the entrance. I don't know if that actually happened or not. I also heard that they were increasing the height of bridge railings and other steps to curb suicide attempts. So essentially, to make it harder for, like you said, unfortunately, hanging is a common form of suicide there. And like I said, jumping off of things. So they basically are trying to find ways to make it harder to access those things that they would do it off of.
That's like we do that here, take away, access to lethal means. That's a good preventative step.
Yeah. So, I mean, they are actively trying, it sounds like. It's just so deeply embedded in their culture that they are struggling. Oh, the last thing they're doing, and I've alluded to this a couple times, they decided to discontinue releasing statistics of the suicide rates. And the idea there is to hopefully prevent glorification of suicide, which I think is super interesting because I don't know, like, it's so hard for me to wrap my head around how that's glorifying it.
Well, just the idea that so many people are doing it glorifies it. And there's an almost romanticized notion of suicide. Like
and that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, it's so hard for me to wrap my head around, like, hearing about suicide and hearing about high rates and thinking of it in like a romanticized way because we view it so differently.
I know.
That's so
well, do we though? I mean, Romeo and Juliet's sort of a romantic suicide story.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is examples,
but that feels so old fashioned, right? And it feels so, and I mean, it's almost like silly.
It is
to some extent.
Like, but there is a similar story that, there's a book, and the name of it, and you can mention it, but it's essentially this book about, these lovers that have this romantic pilgrimage, and they, either one or both ends their life in these trees. And that's like sort of gets in the consciousness of people. And there's another book which is called The Complete Suicide Manual. And this this would not work here. We would push back on this, even though, they say it's mainly popular with, middle school kids. And do you remember when we were in middle school, the things you were probably watching Faces of Death? And I remember hearing of the Anarchist Cookbook. Like, that was a thing kids were talking about. So these really taboo books have gotten the attention of teenagers and young adults.
You just reminded me of, what was it, that 13 question? What was that show that brought up so much controversy?
Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah, 13 whatever.
I know 13 whatevers. 13 Reasons Why.
Yes.
And I did not watch it, so I don't really know the premise, but I know that there was a fear that it glorified suicide a little bit, or romanticized it, like you're saying. Just to note, like, these books that you just mentioned, one of them, the first one, is a 1960 novel, That Tower of Waves by Matsumoto. That's the one where the protagonist dies in the forest at the end. And then the second one you were mentioning actually was 1993, so that's much later, and that's The Complete Manual of Suicide. And the author, that one, he calls the Aokigahara the perfect place to die.
Yeah, and that's not great. That doesn't help. But why are Japanese still committing suicide? And then we can talk about that for a little bit. So again, the changing economy, these men especially can't find meaningful employment, and they feel like a failure. And so it's like there's only enough jobs for 60% of the men there in Japan right now. So it's like you have this burden of these antiquated expectations, but you don't have the opportunity to fulfill it. So it's not like they wouldn't want to be fulfilling these obligations. It's just that they can't, and that leaves you feeling hopeless, and of course pushes you towards the idea of suicide. Plus, I mean, when you think of Japan, you think of technological advances, and what does this create? We see it here. Like, it's a social withdrawal, creates isolation. There's men in Japan that haven't had contact with anybody. Like, they go 6 months. They just use pornography. And this isn't really seen as such a negative thing. It's just, makes sense for them. It's just, these technological advances are scaring me a lot. It makes everything less meaningful.
Yep.
And without meaning, I mean, that's, the direction things head.
Sure. So another thing that really strikes me, and I think that you had kind of noted this, but their culture as a whole, and we talked about like mental health and how that didn't seem to be even like mentioned in the previous like forms of suicide. But I don't think that they're a culture that talks openly about mental health.
Mm.
And even in that sign that I was mentioning, that's at the entrance of the forest, the last part of it says, "Don't keep it to yourself. Talk about your troubles." It's almost kind of highlighting that issue in their culture, right?
Like the stoicism bend to them, like not complaining, not being a burden. These are all things that is very cultural.
Yeah.
We don't mind complaining.
No, we do it all day.
Do it all the time.
All the time. It is very interesting because like, like you said, we don't mind complaining. We're just such an open culture. And I know that for other cultures, it's not that way. So it's hard for us sometimes to envision life being like that, where, we wouldn't talk about something that's bothering us, or
Yeah.
we'd be holding everything in to the point where we can't take any more on. That sometimes feels really tough to envision, but this is obviously cases of this.
Yeah. So Dave, do you want to get into the paranormal parts of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I started with part of it with that idea of the Yuri, and that need to move on. The other part of it is, did you hear about the Rican?
No.
All right, the Rican is when the spirit or soul leaves the body, it waits in purgatory, and that's when it's basically waiting for some kind of like last rites, like whether it's a funeral or some kind of ceremony to be performed, and that kind of tells it's okay that it's passed on and it can kind of go. But if that doesn't happen, so we're talking about bodies that haven't been found, we're talking about people who have committed suicide, and they're being stored or whatever, and who knows what happens to some of the bodies after that. The body either stays in purgatory or latches to the physical world. It's thought, this is what it's thought to have
Yeah.
to
Ghosts.
happen. So they're kind of like, it feels like this culture is kind of heavy in this idea of spirits, unsettled spirits, ghosts. And you think about all the stuff that's going on in this forest, you must envision that there has to be a whole lot of idea of this forest being haunted.
Yeah, you're right. You're making a good point there because, like, for context, the prime minister, he, to the public, told them he moved out of a house because there were vengeful spirits in his house. And the public wasn't like, oh, like there wasn't all these like media outlets being like, what a whack, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
They were like, nah, yeah, all right, I get it. You should move then. And
Yeah.
And another part of this you brought up earlier is the old folks kind of, this isn't something that's new either, because families during hard times throughout history in Japan, they would take a member of the family who has become a burden. Typically, it would be the grandmother. And there's a Japanese word for it, and it's called granny dumping. And this form of, it's sort of murder, like leaving them out in the forest, created these yuris. And yuris are vengeful spirits, like we talked about, but they're also created from suicide. So this forest is full of yuris, which are these scary, vengeful spirits. And the most vengeful of all, according to some texts, are the spirits from suicide.
Yeah.
Which is kind of scary.
Right, because they haven't moved on, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like maybe they haven't gotten that ceremony or whatever it is that's needed to move on. We see a lot of this forest in pop culture. 2 movies in a row in 2016. The Forest and Sea of Trees. Did you see either of these, Dave? Because these are more like,
I went to the theater to see The Forest. Yeah.
And
I was like, so that I think I had like just seen the Vice doc like a little bit before that. So I was like intrigued by this topic, and I saw the movie. At the time, I liked the movie. I honestly don't remember it, and I don't think it was like a great movie, but it piqued my interest just because of the topic.
Well, I looked at both of them, just Rotten Tomatoes. I know that doesn't really matter, but they both really poorly on Rotten Tomatoes. They're both not great.
Oh, it's not something I would like say you should go see The Forest.
Yeah. And then 47 Ronin, which is actually pretty good. With Keanu and The Last Samurai. So those are Tom Cruise and Keanu Reeves as samurai in those movies. But in both movies, they perform seppuku. So that's
not so much a pop culture reference to the forest, but just to like Japanese culture and its theme with suicide. In 2001, there was a film, and like it actually just struck me in this conversation because I always felt like the film is it's called The Suicide Club, and just it's literally, if you ever seen, like, there's a style of Japanese horror that's just really like batshit crazy, like it's just like the most heinous and like offensive things, and like there's a whole genre of their horror films that are like this, and like there's just people committing suicide constantly in this movie, and like it always struck me like how do they, like, if this was an American film, this would never be made.
I know, yeah.
And now I'm kind of understanding, well, like, yeah, I guess part of it is also they look at it a little differently, because like there's so many other things in their culture that get censored. I don't know. But I just had the thought. It's interesting.
Well, yeah, it's a culture of rigid rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's like this idea of something that we see as, quote unquote, so wrong, that they are way more lax on in some way. In some ways.
Yeah. It's interesting, like talking about pop culture. I know that you've maybe I mentioned this to you, the whole Logan Paul incident.
Yeah.
Do you know who this person is, or did you know who this person? Yeah. I mean,
his brother.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I guess at this point everybody knows who they are. But I mean, were you aware that? See, I wasn't aware that he had gone into the forest and made a YouTube video, depicting a person who had completed suicide and kind of like laughing and joking around, and literally just like posting it on YouTube, and it appeared on YouTube's homepage for a moment there. It's like, that's got to be some of the most disgusting behavior. And how is this person still exists? Like, how are they not canceled? I mean, how is that not like, so I'm not a cancel culture guy, that, but in this case, it's like, this is the time to do it.
Yeah.
How does someone get away with that?
Yeah. There's the person has a whole following of people that I feel like are just into that kind of personality, and it's not us, obviously, but
no, it's not us.
I mean, it's that kind of highlights that idea, and we see this like in satire, I think, now, of people who will like do anything for their fame, for their likes, for their subscribers.
Like Tom Green, but like off the wall.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I guess like it's the progression of that kind of person, right?
Like
we all liked Tom Green, but like he also did some really offensive and like upsetting things to people, kind of at times made people the butt of his jokes so that he would, gain something from it. But like, obviously it's that times like 1,000, right?
Right. Absolutely. And this is now, if there's an example of toxic masculinity, it's got to be this idiot. And I hate to say that. Like, I mean, we're talking like negative about specific people on this podcast, but like, maybe we should just move on from it. Cause it really, like, just hearing about this, I hadn't heard about that. And it, I mean,
it's funny. I had heard about it. I never saw it, and I didn't know who it was. But when you said that, and then, so I looked it up, I was like, oh, that's what it was. Cause I did hear that somebody had done it. And I forget, like, it's come up a few times. I've seen it in like satire of in shows and stuff like that, people kind of using that kind of theme. But it's just crazy to think that someone wouldn't be sensitive to the idea that that person has a family and that other people might be offended by that. This also is kind of like the idea, and I know this is a little bit of a tangent. This is kind of like the idea of the families of the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer who got upset by the show about Jeffrey Dahmer showing the murder of their kids. I know it's actors depicting it, but it kind of goes into that territory.
Yeah, like, no, I totally get that.
Yeah, when is it too much? What is the line? Like, how do you know when you've crossed that line? When are we no longer like being respectable to other people involved who might be tied to those people?
Yeah, because you have to admit that there's some value in telling the story with these crimes. I mean, you learn things, and maybe you can prevent them.
The other thing, I forget what this was from. Maybe you'll remember. But there was like a joke like, is it too soon? And then someone was like, you got to give it like, I forget what they said, like 10 years before you can make a joke about something. And I forget what that was from, but like, it's almost like that. It's like, when is it too soon? Is it, when has it been enough time? I don't know. Or is there ever enough time with certain things?
Yeah, like tragedy plus time equals comedy. I think that's like the formula.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, let's just get this out of the way here because this is the truth. Like, the way where we stand, and I think Dave, you'll agree, is like nobody is better off without you in your life. Right. If you're people might feel like, oh, these people would be better off without me. My parents would be better off without me. My family, my kids would be better off without me. But there's never a kid or a parent or someone whose life gets better when someone commits suicide. It just doesn't work that way. So what happens though is if somebody like your family watches you struggle, they'll eventually, if you push through it, they'll watch you recover, and you, the person without hope, become someone's hope. And that's like a beautiful thing. So if you're going through hell, keep going. That's a Winston Churchill quote there.
Nice.
And Dave, we should also add, we have a responsibility to add that the suicide prevention information, now you just dial 988.
Yep.
And something else? I did that for a little while at BH Link.
You dialed 988?
No. I when someone dialed 888, I would say hello.
Yeah, I did know that. You did your internship over there.
Yeah, that was heavy.
Yeah.
That's something
So did you have full on dialogues with people who were contemplating?
Yeah, and more often than not, it was just you're so worried. You're like, damn, I got to get this right. I mean, of course, right? This is like the pressure's on, but people just kind of wanted someone to talk to. I think that's what people want. People want someone not to tell you that they understand or this or that. They just want they want to know that, you feel for them and it's hard. And
yeah,
I mean, anything you can do to kind of give them a little bit of hope, that's all you're really trying to do.
So that's important, Greg. What you're identifying is actually what the people around that person need to do as well. Because if you do know someone is struggling, it can be really hard to know what to do.
You almost want to avoid it if you're,
You want to avoid it, or sometimes people want to fix the problem. But like, I think more importantly is sometimes people just need to talk and not feel like someone's trying to fix them. Because then you're just kind of making it more highlighting more to them that, there is something wrong with me. I need to be fixed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or I'm such a burden on people. They always feel like they have to help me with stuff.
Yeah.
So you don't want to do that. You just want to open your ears and listen.
No, you are needed. You're not a burden. No one's going to be better without you. You are a part of something. We do want you here, and you're not hopeless. Like, I always think of that Van Gogh story that we mentioned in the depression episode where he committed suicide, not knowing his own greatness. Mm-hmm. Like, he had sold one painting to a friend. So, he dies, and then all of a sudden, that thing that he wanted to happen for everyone to appreciate him, it's happening, but he wasn't there to observe it. So it's like, sometimes you're done with the world, but the world's not done with you. Like, hang on there a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that's an important message. Like, and things are always darkest before the dawn. That's in like 1,000 songs.
That's the thing right there. I think that's super important for people to understand. When you're feeling low, like, at some point it will get better, but like, also just do something with that low feeling. Like, put it out there into something. How many people have made amazing art or something with some of those feelings that they've had? And it's powerful.
That is powerful. That is powerful. Like doing something with the darkness. So like, not trying to push it away. Like, that Ram Dass guy has that quote, "The shadow is the greatest teacher for how to come to the light." I don't fully understand it. But it's true. Like, you saying that, it's like, when you're dark, when you're in the darkest place, that's when you can see the light. That's when you can look for it. That's when you need it the most. And that's where you're in a best position to find it. Any bit of light. And once you find a little bit, you get more and more. It's a really difficult thing, but you're never alone when it comes to this kind of stuff. Someone will always be around to talk to, and that's why that number 988 is so important. Reach out to that, but never stop reaching out, because someone will help you.
And eventually you'll be able to help someone else. You'll be able
everything.
to help them understand that like they're not alone with what they're dealing with, and you can like relate. And back to the sign at the entrance of the suicide forest. Don't keep it to yourself. Talk about your troubles.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a burden.
You're not a samurai. Like, you're just not.
You're not a samurai. You wish you were, but you're not.
That's right.
No,
all right, Dave. I think we can end on that.
After I learned about what samurais do, I'm like, nah, I don't want to be a samurai.
Yeah, you used to want to be one, but now I think that's a lot.
No,
that's a lot.
I'll just do what I'm doing, actually.
Yeah.
All right. Well, interesting episode. Sort of heavy, but also just very intriguing. Yeah.
Just those words together are intriguing, to be honest. Suicide forest.
Yeah.
Like, what's the deal?
It does suck that suicide is such a trigger word in our culture that you almost feel like, I feel weird saying it even on this podcast. Because I'm like, even saying it, I'm like, am I gonna offend someone? Is it gonna trigger someone? And like, that's not the intention, but it is. The word just has so much weight to it for us. And that's makes it tough sometimes to have open dialogue about it, but it is an important topic to talk about.
Dave, especially for us, it's like for us, it just represents the ultimate failure. Yeah. I mean, I hate that word too. I hate it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, but we did, we had a responsibility to tackle it at some point. And I think doing it through the lens of this forest was, probably the best way possible.
I think it was a good opening step to it.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, any housekeeping, Greg? You doing all right?
I'm doing great. If people could just,
keep listening.
Keep listening. That's right.
Let's keep listening. That's all.
Dave doesn't like begging for reviews, so I won't.
No. Just keep listening.
Just keep listening. That's it. And tell your friends if you enjoy it.
Tell your friends. That'd be great. Tell your friends.
Share it on whatever.
Any platform.
That's fine.
But thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully you were enlightened as much as we were this week by learning about this topic. And we will be back next week with probably something a little less heavy, but I can't make any promises.
Yeah.
I honestly can't. We'll figure that out when time comes. Have a great night. Have a great week. Have a great year. Have a blessed day. Under his eye, as they would say on the Handmaid's Tale. See you later.